Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Core Energy Experience. I'm your host, Kurt Bruckmann. I hold my mastery in core energy dynamics. I'm a certified global coach. I write for Brains Magazine, and I am an internationally acclaimed best-selling author. Our guest today is Amanda Solar. She is a host of the SolFul Connections podcast and founder of SolFul Living, a platform to help people build their most meaningful lives. I'm joined here in the studio with our co-producer and associate director, Alex Fabio. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're on. We appreciate your energy and support. Without you, this podcast would not be possible. Now here's our conversation with Amanda Solar. Look at you. Thank you so much. How are you doing today? Thank you for coming on. That's awesome.
I am so happy you asked me to be a guest. So thank you for having me on. I'm doing great.
Oh, that's great to hear. There's a lot to talk about, you and I for sure. So what we'd like to do is to start this about you, to tell us, the audience, and all about yourself from whatever timeline you like to start to present and perhaps future. And then we're going to discuss, well-being and all what it's all about. So.
Well, Kurt, it all began when my mom and dad fell in love. No, I'm just kidding. I won't take you back that far. Well, basically my prior life, before I established SolFul Living and SolFul Connections, I was COO of a Chamber of Commerce, a large Chamber of Commerce in southeastern Pennsylvania. And I was an editor of a magazine, a community and business magazine. And I was loving that life and that experience, helping people grow their businesses, building community and arts programs, creating this magazine. And really, I will go back a little way just to tell you that, my life, I was always one of those seekers. So I was always, since I was little, reading books about being really fully in our humanness. And I started doing yoga in 5th grade, which I think is kind of an unusual thing. So that was happening. That was all happening. But I loved this career, which connected me with people and people who were building their dreams. And in about 2006, my middle daughter caught a cold and she stopped breathing.
Oh my gosh.
And it was a long journey. She ended up in the hospital in intensive care. She needed open heart surgery. But ultimately, we were told that she couldn't survive because she had this really tiny airway and it had rings encircling it. It was the size of a coffee straw. And they said, this airway can't grow and she will grow, so she can't survive that. I'll just jump to the end of that story real quickly and tell you that today she is 20 years old and, caused all sorts of good trouble out there. And, but it put us in intensive care and it put a halt onto our lives. And that halt really lasted beyond that 6 months in CHOPS intensive care because, it ended up we needed some physical therapists and oxygen tanks, and it was a journey. But I have to say, when I went back to my life at the chamber, I started thinking, okay, I have information and just about life and about living and about how to find joy even when life is a mess, how to really find our wholeness and a lot of other things, I learned. And I guess probably 2017, I started thinking, well, what can I do with this? I was an editor of a magazine. So I would think, I could, create my own magazine, and so on and so forth. And then when the pandemic happened in 2020, I had a minute because by that time I was the mom of 3 daughters. I was a wife. I was COO, all the things.
Busy.
And I remember thinking, this is the time. Like, I have a minute. And I started to think, well, I could create a magazine. And then I thought, but I'd have to get advertisers, and, I knew because I already produced a community and business magazine. So I went on YouTube and learned how to build a website. And as I was building this website in my bedroom, I was kind of going, what do I want to share? For no reason other than that I wanted to share it. And then also at that time, I started a podcast called Two Mamas and a Microphone with an associate of mine.
What a great name.
It was really fun. We just hit record and started talking. There was nothing other than we just felt like recording our conversations.
Excellent. Yeah. Why not?
And that taught me a little bit about talking on a podcast. And then when life resumed, I went back to my job at the chamber, but still kept the podcast. Only by this time, it was my own podcast. Because, everybody went back to their, quote, normal lives. Right. And I had asked a musician friend to write a theme song because I wanted my own song for the opening. And he sang the word connections. And that kind of titled the podcast, really. And, ultimately the chamber in 2022, it kind of crumbled and disassembled and became a much smaller organization. And I walked into this, working with SolFul Living, where I go into companies and do teamwork programs, and I coach one-on-one, and I teach meditation because, as an aside, I did get a certification in meditation instruction with the Chopra organization.
Excellent.
And then I followed that with a certification with the Integrative Institute of Health as a health coach, just so that I could know, how do you coach? I had with the chamber, I was helping people grow their businesses, but, working one-on-one with people is different. So that is my story, Kurt, in a nutshell.
That's a big story in a nutshell. I got to tell you that. Interesting that the chamber is what it is. It as you know, it can grow and then recede with population because people come in and out of town.
Yeah.
They time out, whatever it might be. It's not needed so much. But the fact you're in their servants is not surprising from what you have been describing to us about who you are. Certainly a big part of who Amanda is, that serving part.
Yeah.
Let's just go back for a minute to the yoga. What triggered that movement, that decision to take action in there at such a young stage of your life?
So when I was younger, I went through 12 years of Catholic school, and I was a voracious reader. I always tell my girls, we didn't have the internet or 24 hours television, and I read a lot. And so I was always interested in everything. I read a lot of fiction, but that exposed and interested me, to a lot of different topics. And I was in 5th grade at the Scholastics Book Fair in St. Jude's Elementary School. And I picked it up and I thought, okay, bought it. And then I did yoga on our back deck every evening.
All by yourself.
All by myself. And,
great.
Isn't that, it's kind of crazy. And I was just telling the story that when I was younger, I used to work, in Catholic school. In the evening, they used to have bingo. Maybe they still do. That was a big thing, bingo.
And I like bingo. Bingo's great. Right? Bring it on. Yeah.
Right. So I would help my mom serve pizza. And I remember talking to somebody and saying, oh, I'm doing yoga. And they were like, no, that's a different religion. It was so such another time, right? My mom was like, don't listen, just do your yoga, But there is something about the fact that when I was so young, I was kind of, when yoga works from the outside in. So when you do it, it just alters you. And it really just calms you. And I think when you're calm and you're kind of in touch with yourself, you really feel connected to larger aspects of life. And so that introduced me to that at a young age.
You're talking now your spirituality, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, and it was an interesting spirituality, which was an adjunct to what I was learning in school, which was like religion, which is not quite exactly the same, you know?
Yeah, definitely different.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that to define it, because we do in the core energy dynamics, part of it is our six influencers, and one of them's spiritual, environmental, mental, physical, social. And so when I bring up the spiritual, the audience somewhat will start to squirm a little bit, because it's not religion. That's we have to define that pretty quickly. We're all born with our own spirituality. So
I think that's such an important distinction because, your spirituality could be that you walk in nature and you're connected to the sky and the trees and the clouds and that the vastness of the world. And it could be something much more rooted in like a more typical religion, whether it's Muslim or Christian or Hindu or whatever it is. I think it's really just what fuels you. It's a sense of expansion, and that can be found in a variety of ways, and it's really what works for you. But I agree with you. I think that, connecting to something larger than yourself is really an essential part of leading a fulfilled life.
I agree. Let's go there for a little bit. So, with the core based energy is, something we resonate with big, as you know. And we have found and identified that, to your point, we have to start somewhere. And so we start with our core. And that's where we are always residing from. And then we have what you call adjuncts, the add-ons to it, to your point, different means of spirituality in each and every one of us. So when you are working with people, how do you bring up and how do you work with their spirituality?
So when I'm working with people, what I usually start with is the word nourish. What nourishes you? And we just start there. And I think that, when we start with what nourishes you, what feeds you, we kind of get to that larger picture. So when we talk about nourishment, we do talk about food and movement. And we also talk about, whatever it is that feeds you spiritually. And again, that could be a connection with nature. It could be classical music, like whatever it is that feeds you. We start there, and then I move from nourishment onto centering because, I do have my certification in meditation instruction, and I'm kind of like a broken record. Do people know what a broken record is now at this stage in the game,
Yeah.
Kurt?
I don't know, but I was taught as a very young boy, 3, 4, 5 years old, to appreciate nature, to work with nature, be in nature, even to understand, how it operates, i.e. there's always lightness. There's always light in nature somewhere around. And I'd be walking with my grandfather or my father through woods. We lived in a wooded area. And save from my father, I'd be walking with him, and he'd be holding my hand. And one time he said, Kurt, I'm going to let go of your hand, and I'm going to walk ahead of you. And I got teary-eyed, and he said, don't fear anything. What do you fear from? Well, it's dark, Dad. I don't see any light. He said, Kurt, there's always light. It's a temporary thing. Look up, there's stars. Or if it's a cloudy night, there might not be, but there's always a bit of light somewhere. That was the message. And that if it's not in the moment right now, it's coming. Light's going to come. Physical light we're talking about. And
I love that.
Yeah. And that really set me off to really appreciate nature, notice nature, be a part of nature. And it's part of who I am. So it brought me fully into understanding behavior. I studied behavior when I was younger. always was watching out on behavior and appreciate people and how they interact with one another, what that means. But to me, it's a lot of it's nature based, and then we go back to the spirituality of that too.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how everyone looks at it a little bit different, but there's always something in that spirituality moment that we can find is, to your point, to peace and to that calm, right?
Right. I think that without centering, you don't really know what makes you happy. You don't really know what you want. What I do when I recently had the opportunity to teach 7th to 9th graders meditation.
Wow.
And yeah, I know, right? It was so wonderful to not only be forcing my opinions and thoughts on my daughters, but to get to extend beyond them. But
Sure.
really what I can relate to a 7th to 9th grade girl, because the world is really noisy and expectations out there can feel like your own expectations. Other people's desires can feel like our desires. It's really hard to separate that noise.
That's our measuring ourselves to other people, which we know not to do, right?
That's right. But it's so normal to do. I mean, it's really rooted in primal survival instincts. To be
Yes.
part of a group is very, very primal. And so a lot of what we do is just very much rooted in that, reptilian part of our brains that is just all about survival.
Yeah.
And
we don't
fitting
succeed
in.
don't succeed in isolation. Just want to add that in there because that's what we're talking about now, the collaboration and working with other people and like energy.
Yeah. Yeah. And, to find what is my energy. Who are
Right.
my people? What do I want them to look like? You kind of have to get quiet for a second. And we're not good at that, especially today. We have so many distractions, and distractions are so appealing. Our brain loves distractions. Our
Indeed.
brain would like nothing else but to be busy all of the time.
So true. Yes.
So, yeah, so centering is like a next step for me.
That's great. And when you go into that meditation with the children,
Yeah.
how do they receive that? How does that come out? I mean, how do you get them to be so calm and being able to meditate? A lot of people have difficulty with, including myself, when I first learned about it.
Yeah, I think, well, it's kind of challenging for adults and for kids to quiet our minds. But I will say that it doesn't have to be, 20 minutes. It can be 30 seconds. What I do with younger people is just like this bubble exercise. Picture your thoughts and picture them in a bubble and just kind of watch them. Close your eyes and just watch your thoughts. Even if you do that for a minute, because it is interesting to see, and I explain to them, 98% of our thoughts are the same ones. We think the same thoughts all day long.
Cycle.
Exactly. And it's kind of saying, oh, I'm thinking about that, I'm watching your thoughts. So kind of mindfulness, we start there. And I also explain that our brains, it doesn't want us to be quiet. It likes drama and it likes engagement. And I also talk about the fact that even when you're alone in your room, your brain is still active. She's still talking. And what she says is not always accurate, and it's not always helpful, and it's not always kind.
That's
So,
for sure.
that's kind of what we talk about. But I don't do anything where we're sitting there silently for a really extended period of time.
Makes sense.
I think even myself, it's a discipline. And I explain, it's kind of like lifting weights. When you're lifting weights, you don't feel fabulous. P.S. Kurt, I've only heard, because I don't lift weights.
There you go.
Next week, I'll start.
Right. Yeah.
But
Stretching is the new lifting weights.
I do that.
There you go.
But when you're lifting them, you're not automatically stronger. It's the practice of doing it, and the reward comes later. It doesn't come really while you're lifting the weights. And that's the same with meditation. It's in and of itself, it's not always the most pleasurable thing that you'll do. The reward is later when you're able to navigate through crisis or through just even a conversation that's uncomfortable, and you do it with a little bit more grace.
Sure. There you go. Absolutely. Well, that word grace, we like kindness and grace. A bunch of them respect. It's interesting when I'm working with people and we start talking about how we quiet ourselves or how we bring ourselves back into the center, the core, if you will, and work from within out. I'll use a hurricane metaphor. In other words, the hurricane, what's going on in the hurricane? To your point, noise, there's a lot going on there. And people can get very intimidated by it. They can withdraw. Perhaps they might get engaged, but they get thrown out, however it might be. So in the hurricane, people get quiet. And then I'll look into the audience and I'll say, well, what's in the middle of the hurricane? Ah, the hands start to go up, the eye. Yeah, the eye. What's the eye? The calm. So
Yeah.
to your point, there is this availability we have, and all people have it, is to be able to find that center, as you referred to it, the core, and the energy we have within to work on to bring it outside. And, just to be able to use metaphors like that, are settling, what your metaphor was as well. Very settling. People can identify to that more,
Yes.
And it's really about that and the communication of, what we want to be identified and how that comes out. So tell me, do you deal with NLP, neuro-linguistic programming?
No. I mean, the most I have dealt with that is, affirmations, but I don't know much about it. So I don't want to pretend that I do.
Yeah. Well, it very simply, neuro-linguistic programming is how language influences our thoughts and our behavior. That's really it, and how we speak to ourselves. So one of the
Yeah.
reasons why I incorporated it into the core energy dynamics is because we tend, the inner critic, you pointed that out a little while ago. There's a lot that cycling of thought. How do I get out of the rabbit hole? This, that, and the other thing. So with the speaking different language, a different way to ourselves, we're able to work with and get our core abilities out more successfully and in a kinder way. So in other words, an example I'll use, well, if we want to lose 10 pounds in a week, and the goal is to lose 10 pounds, well, we get to the week and the week's over, I've lost only 8 because I set a goal. Well, how does it feel if we say intention? The intention is to lose 10 pounds, and I've lost 8. So it's a win essentially, because we're not placing that hard, dynamic on ourselves that it must be done, that goal word. So it's shifting different words in different ways so we can speak to ourselves gently,
Yeah.
more kindly, and deliver that to the world. Because as you know, the world is very tumultuous right now.
Yes.
But anyway, we'll get to that later on. The self-mastery, a part of who you are. Can we go there and explain to the audience what that means to you and to everyone else and how that is executed?
Well, that's interesting because just talking about, language, self-mastery, I don't know that I use that terminology, but I will say I do talk a lot about self-actualization, which maybe is the same, the same concept.
Yeah, a bit. Sister brothers, maybe, to your
Yeah.
point. They are definitely
Cousins.
different. Yeah, cousins. There we go. Yeah,
Yeah.
cousins.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, when I think self-mastery, I think that, for example, go back to the nourishment. So when I'm thinking nourishment, I think about food, words, all of the things that are fulfilling, books, learning. But of course, I'll reach, say, for candy. But then I think, well, what am I hungry for in that moment? What am I actually hungry for? What is the need that's fulfilling? And when I think about self-mastery, that's kind of what I think. I think it's really about understanding what compels us to do something. And then we're better able to make more evolved choices. So I think about what you were just saying about the goals. And I think sometimes people will say, well, I never make New Year's goals because they never happen. And I do think it's because they think, okay, this year I'm going to read 20 books. I'm going to walk 5 miles a day. I'm going to lose 20 pounds. And then they kind of go on with their lives, and it doesn't really happen because those are really hard things to change, and they don't kind of look at their habits and look at the steps and look at their why and look at all the things that they need to look at in order to make those changes. So when I think about self-mastery, I guess what I think about is, okay, let's look at the life I want. Let's look at who I want to be, because another one of those 4, I talked about nourishment and connection. There's also alignment.
Yeah.
So am I who I say I am? Am I who I want to be? Is it all in alignment? Who I am, who I actually am, who I wish to be, and who I say I am. Are they all the same? And so for me, self-mastery is about making that all aligned. Who I am, who I want to be, and who I say I am, all in alignment. Does that make sense?
Taking the action. It does 100%.
Yeah. And then breaking down those actions, because honestly, and breaking down why I even want them and what they all mean to me. I think that the whole self-actualization is a lifelong journey and a very intricate and deep activity.
Yes. To your point, we need to work on ourselves, and we can achieve whatever we really desire. You hear so many people who have overcome things, i.e. your daughter. The impossible, we're told it's the impossible. One of my taglines is from impossible to impossible, because impossible is in the impossible word, right?
Yeah.
And it's so important for us to realize that it's not easy. Things are not an easy fix. And perhaps if they are an easy fix, then maybe there's something different that we don't know about that might be coming up a little later in the subject or whatever it may be. But, we go back again to your daughter, and let's go there for a little bit.
Sure.
And finding that well-being, how did you and your daughter and family as a whole, this is a loaded question.
Sure.
How did you all find that peace that you're talking about, that the ability to be centered and to break through hearing the no's and understanding that they're going to, you're going to strive for yeses and you're going to overcome, not succumb. There, you had a lot going on there. Can you break that down a little bit for us and how you guys achieved such profound success with it all?
Sure. So, and there were stages. So I will say when my daughter was born, I kept thinking something was wrong. And I judged myself for thinking that because I thought, what is wrong with me? And I would mention things to the doctor. Like I would say, hey, she was my second child. So I would say, my other one was able to pick her head up at this point. And the doctors would say, oh, Mom, they're all different and that kind of thing. And I just felt something was wrong. And then it got to a point where she was 6 months and really caught a terrible cold and long story, but ended up in intensive care, intubated. And they couldn't extubate her. They just couldn't get her off the ventilator to breathe on her own, and they couldn't figure it out. And because, she looks like any other baby at that point. And I always say she's creatively constructed internally. You can't see it, but everything inside of her is very creatively made. And so in the very beginning, I have to say one of my first lessons is that every time a doctor told me something and I didn't believe it, I would call a friend and I would say, oh my gosh, this is happening. And my friend would say, get to the hospital. This is wrong. Don't listen. And one of the things that I will say I learned start to finish is build your community. The people around you are so essential. And I'll go even a step further. When they found out that my daughter was in such dire straits, and, they sat us down, and one time they sat me down with grief counselors, and they said she can't survive. And I think they expected, me to collapse. And I was just thinking, well, no, she's going to survive, because my brain just, you can't go there. It was too big. And that doesn't mean to imply that there were not days where I was sitting in the hallway of the hospital crying. I had days where I would be driving and I would be screaming. I literally would scream while driving the car. So I don't want to imply that I was just skipping merrily through thinking positive thoughts, because
Well, I hope no one's taken any of this lightly, because this
yeah,
is very deep. This is very moving. And I just want to say something real quick, and you can please go on. You created your success posse, and that's a big thing that we push in the core energy dynamics. Surround yourself with people that can help and be a win-win. You help back and serve back. So we call it a success posse.
a success what?
Posse.
Oh, I love it.
Build your
Success posse. Because I
build your
will
success
say, I'll
posse.
take that one step further. When I would have doctors who would sit down with me, I had one doctor who was crying, and she said, we love her. We feel bad. We don't want her to die. We feel so bad about this. And I thought, you're off the team. Because I had this mentality, and I think my father kind of endowed me with this. If somebody doesn't believe, they can't be on the team. I will say, unless they were essential to her survival. There was like an airway specialist who didn't believe it would end well, but we needed him, and so there he stayed with us. But if I was dealing with somebody who did not believe that she could survive, they were not part of the team. I've taken that lesson from the hospital into life. If you don't believe in me, you're off my team. And I feel that, so that's, I guess, my version of the success posse.
Absolutely. Excellent.
Yeah. And, I also learned, I had a lifetime of trying to please others and make everybody happy with me. And I was in a situation where I believed something different than doctors. And so they would sit around me telling me one thing, and I believed something different.
Talk about trusting your process, Amanda. Whoa. That's
And,
what you're doing.
I sometimes think, because she was still so young, that it was very primal. As a mother, I was kind of operating from a very primal place. But I do remember thinking, I can't worry about what they think about me, because it's my daughter's life. And again, taking that into just everyday life, it teaches you can't really worry about that. The only degree I worried about it was, I thought, okay, everything was motivated in my life to have people in our room in intensive care. So I didn't want to be antagonistic. I made sure that I was pleasant to be around, and as much as possible, because I really did want everybody to want to be in our room where we lived for those 6 months. Everything in my life was dedicated to the life of our family, not just the life of my daughter. I had another daughter who was there in the hospital room. She went to nursery school, and then my husband would bring her to the hospital. And people say, well, you had her in intensive care? And yes, because that's where we were. And so that was, our family, that's where we lived. And actually, that daughter, my oldest daughter, she thinks fondly, strangely enough, she thinks back upon that time as remember, it was like a grand adventure. And that's how we kind of posed it. And my middle daughter she had a critical airway, so she was laying there with lots of wires, and she was on a ventilator. And I would say to my older daughter, touch her, and, she can feel you, and just maintaining that relationship So I think, there were so many lessons, even about belief. I don't understand belief. I don't understand prayer. I don't understand when you live in intensive care in Children's Hospital, you see babies die and you see babies live. And I'm not presumptuous enough to say that I understand why that is. What I learned is that I just have to surrender the intellectual part of myself when I'm in that kind of a crisis and choose to believe. And so I remember thinking, well, that old biblical, you can't take, you can take the girl out of Catholic school, but you can't take the Catholic out of the girl. So I would I would remember that line, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, which is really small. And sometimes that's all the faith that I had. Sometimes I didn't have more than that. But it taught me that there's a power within us or around us that we can access that I cannot explain and I can't begin to understand, but it's there. And, I just leave that there, but that is really one of my lessons.
It's in our core, that's part of who we are to your reference to it and to how I sort of frame it. Same, but different talk about it a little bit. Really empowering and interesting that you're able to call upon yourself to maintain that anabolic energy. And the core energy dynamics, we work with two different types of energy. Anabolics, the filling, the constructive, the high energy, the dopamine fill, to resonate things in a way that's going to be fulfilling. The other is the opposite, is the catabolic, the draining, the breakdown, the deconstructive, the low-lying energy, the catabolic dumps, the cortisol dumps, rather, happening there. In a time where the cortisol was flying, the low-lying energy was there, the energy was rampant in every way imaginable. Really, listening to this is so moving. And you chose to take it to the anabolic, that filling, constructive manner, so everyone around you could feel it. And you generated such empowering energy. Really interesting to hear about all of it, Amanda. And thank you for delivering that. Wow. So let's go into well-being a little bit. Will you explain to the audience what well-being means to you and to your life and how you help other people understand what well-being is?
Sure. So for me, I think we talked a little bit earlier about the whole of our person. So well-being to me is about being well physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And I do think we are all bio-individual. So I do think what works for me might not work for you, and so on. I think health, though, is multidimensional. So for myself and just for any of my clients, I do focus on the multidimensionality of health and our own bio-individuality. So it really is about finding, number one, again, what you want your life to look like and how you want to live in the world, and then building underneath that, building that life. And that is everything from nourishment, food, to movement, to purpose. I mean, when I was with the chamber, we had a health and wellness committee. And back in the day, we started, as soon as National Geographic came out with the blue zones, those parts of the world where people live the longest, we started reading about that and incorporating that into our health and wellness programs at the Chamber of Commerce. So that's kind of something I still incorporate. And I think about, those people in Okinawa, for example. So it's not just about eating what's there, what's natural to that environment, but it's also, they have ikigai, which is purpose. They have something called a moai, which I have. It's when you're in Okinawa, they give you people from the time you're born throughout your life. And that's your moai. Those are your people. Those are you call them success posse. That's your success posse. And they believe that's one of the secrets to a long and fulfilling life. So who was in your moai? We talk about that. So it really, wellness to me is very multi-layered. Oh, and one thing I think is so important is it's about movement. It's not necessarily about going to a gym. I mean, my mom and dad are 90 and 91, and they are vibrant, and I look to them, and they've always focused on relationship, focused on reading and building their mental acuity. They have always been rooted in service and purpose.
Yeah.
They have always moved, and they might not go to a gym, but they've weeded the garden, walked their dog, so that kind of thing. To me, that's what wellness looks like.
Beautiful. Yes. Agree with all of it, and how you frame it is really interesting and empowering. People don't hear this type of talk so much anymore, or I should say, are getting used to hearing it again. More and more of it's coming out. So people like you are in such high demand, and more people are willing to listen and to do the work and to understand what Amanda's professing on how to work with oneself for a better lifestyle, a better means of being. And, it's... we need it now more than ever. You know this. You've been in the industry, a long time, and you've been through some very harrowing life experiences. And so happy that your daughter came out of everything and is as beautiful as it is today. How is the family after all of that? If you could just touch one more time, it's a difficult subject, I know, but you speak it so well. When you guys went into this action with your daughter, and then you came out and everything started healing, and you were getting back to some sort of what we call normalcy, whatever the heck that may be. But anyway, how was that for you guys?
I think about that time, when we first came back into normal life, it was not quite so normal. We had a lot of, my daughter had an NG tube, so she was hooked up to a machine to feed her. We were, both my husband and I had to learn how to replace an NG tube because she would rip it out. She was on an every 2 hours feeding cycle. And then we had occupational therapists and physical therapists. And yet I went back and I thought, okay, I'm back to work. I'm doing my yoga. I'm doing all of this. My husband was doing his work. We were taking care of our kids. And one day I opened my closet door and I was crawling around for shoes. I was going probably to a business card exchange or some other chamber function. And they were buried. And I opened my eyes and I looked at my closet. And my closet, I'm not even the neatest person in the world, but it looked like somebody had vandalized it. It was so crazy because I had come home from the hospital and I had bags and I threw them in there and I went back to life. And honestly, in that moment, I said, stop. You need to stop. You are pretending life is the same, and it's not the same. And that is something I think is so important for everybody to hear. Sometimes bad things are happening, and you kind of have to surrender and stop what you're doing and regroup. I looked up the origin of the word resilience because I kind of feel like I'm a resilient person. Well, interestingly, it's kind of like rooted in this coil, and it's there's a part of the coil which stops and is ready to spring, but it's kind of recoiled. It's rooted resilience in recoiling. And I think we have to remember that. I think we have to remember that sometimes we need to just stop. So that's kind of what we did as a family. we paused. And that was when I went, what just happened to us? I mean, we were a little out of the woods, not quite out of the woods. That came years and years and years later. But I remember reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He had been in the Holocaust, and he found meaning in the horrors that he and his family experienced.
Yeah.
And I just needed to see, like, how can I find meaning in this situation? So it was a rebuilding process. It was a rebuilding. Another thing that happened is when I went back to my normal life, I didn't recognize at first, but I recognized ultimately I had kind of lost my compassion gene. My compassion was rooted in compassion for my family, saving the life of my daughter and saving the health of my family. And I didn't have any left. So it was building that compassion gene back up. It was what happens when you live in an intensive care and things are happening to other people that you can't control. Oof. So there was a rebuilding, and I think that is what happened. And then we found ourselves, we had a third child. She was like a little unexpected gift.
Oh, that's beautiful. Beautiful.
So, we just basically went back and rebuilt who we were as a family, redefined that. Of course, had many different, challenges and crises that every family has. And I would say where we are today as a family is really rooted in connection for one another and the desire for all of the best for each other.
Fabulous.
When we were in the hospital, there was a point where my husband thought one thing and I thought another thing. And this is about the life of our daughter.
Ooh.
And that could be really a break in a relationship.
Absolutely. It has torn families apart. You know that. Things like this have torn families apart.
Absolutely. And understandably. But yes. I do remember one time they were taking her away for surgery. And we were standing together, kind of just leaning into each other. And one thing that I always knew is that there was only one person in the world who would be as damaged and broken if my daughter died. And that's my husband. And so, that's a very deep connection because one thing that we always wanted was the life of my daughter. So whatever our differences about how that could be achieved, they paled in comparison to that ultimate desire. And so ultimately, I think crisis with us has always reconnected and reaffirmed our relationship.
Your joint spirituality, if I may.
Yeah.
It's part of what attracted you and your husband and then your children all along.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing. If I may, change equals awareness plus understanding. So this is a part of what you guys went through in a very, very intense way. And in the core energy dynamics, Amanda, we start with something to help us understand how we work with transition and ultimate transformation. And that is we start with the awareness. And then we move into the acceptance. And with the acceptance, we validate it. Now we've given ourselves opportunity to start looking at choice, and we profess to choose conscious choice, not the knee-jerk reaction choice.
Yeah.
With that being said, we now make ourselves available to trust our process into the transition and ultimately into a transformation. This is what we do all of our lives. It's not one stage. It's something that is a continuum. So as you profoundly put it, you guys went through it in, oh my gosh, in severe and intense ways, and you upheld, you were resilient, you collaborated with others, sometimes really not wanting to, but making the decision to do such. And in that collaboration, you formed, again, the success posse, but you formed your people around you that were able to assist in every way. Remember, we don't succeed in isolation. We can't do it alone. You hear doctors talking about that, and ones that are very upfront about it say, hey, look, it's not just me, it's the so-called assistants, and it's really everybody. It's a collaborative. And it sounds like you did a lot of that there. And when you were talking about what you do for your career and your business, it's there too. You've mentioned that. Really, really resounding things. So if I may ask, what is your daughter up to these days?
She's really doing well. She is a jewelry designer at this point in her life. And she's always been very creative, but she's also she's very smart, and she is really doing well. When she was about 14, she's just turned 20 in June. We were told that she could survive her airway, which we were told what couldn't grow did grow. It continued to grow, and we would always obviously check on that because she has some other inner anatomical differences that cause her a little bit of a challenge. Sure. But honestly, she handles her challenges with grace. And it's interesting, I keep using the word grace because my oldest daughter's name is Grace.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, appropriate.
But yeah, I have 3 daughters, and they're all really, they're inspiring to me. They're complicated and interesting, and I love listening to them and learning from them.
God, that's fabulous. Always learning, right? Isn't that it? We're always growing.
100%.
We never stop growing. Your example from your children to your parents at 90 and 91 who continue to feed themselves. And for all our audience, please, this is what Amanda and I like to help with, is that we never stop growing. We run into our difficulties, but there are pathways through them, around them, however we need to get over it, because there's more coming. And, to keep ourselves prepared, right, Amanda? To let us, again, step into ourselves. And that's what we really hope all of you have been working on yourself these days, because it's important. Life is faster than it's ever been, and I'm sure you'll agree. We grew up in sort of we did grow up in an analog age, and things were matriculating slowly. And then we hit the computer stage in the mid-90s, late 90s, and then 2000 YK, everything's going to go dark, the fear of that coming in.
Yes.
And then this constant rebirth of rejuvenation of what the internet meant to us, i.e. the advancement of cell phones, et cetera. And the pandemic comes along. It's been a lot of change, and now AI is here. So, all these things are very disruptive, and this is what we were talking about earlier, and you and I have found similar pathways to calm ourselves and be able to collect ourselves and be able to execute to the best of our ability of what we desire. And that's, part of what it's all about. There's not one thing, as we know, because we're multidimensional humans, and there's others, but we certainly have touched on something very important today, and Amanda. And I thank you for being so raw and authentic today. It's really been very inspiring, and the content you've been delivering is fantastic. So I want to thank you for that. Definitely.
Well, Kurt, thank you so much for what you're doing with Core Energy, and for having me on the podcast, and for having these important conversations. I do think they move all of us forward, and I appreciate coming on, and I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Amanda. Back at you on all that. So if I may, just one last question before we get ready to sign off, and then we'll have you give us some place where we can find Amanda and what you do and all. So one last question is simply this. You're a white sheet, blank piece of paper right now. The world is in a very tumultuous time. There's a lot of changes, shifting, misdirection, redirection going on more than any time in modern history. Mankind, perhaps, we might be able free to say that. So if you would, what would you, as a white page right now, like to see happen in the world as it is today?
Well, I think I would love to start with all of us learning. This is going to sound corny as I'm saying it, but to love
it's never corny.
to love ourselves. And I'll tell you why. I think when I look at the world, it looks, we're sick right now. It seems like a lot of us are sick. We're operating from places of damage and of trauma. And
Yes.
I think that things that we're seeing, cruelty or war or whatever it is, it's rooted in illness and in damage. And I was thinking recently about, when people say you've got to love yourself, what does that even mean?
Yes.
What does that mean? And I think we start with loving ourselves, which means in looking at ourselves, looking at our inner pockets of pain, which is kind of scary, but accepting who we are and celebrating who we are. And then I think on that white page, I would move out from ourselves and do the same for your family, and then do the same for your neighbors, and then do the same for your community, and keep extending that acceptance and celebration of self well beyond the core. Kurt, I'll use your word.
Thank you.
Starting with the core and moving out. That, I guess, would be my initial just off the cuff answer to that really deep question.
Yes, it is. And you fielded it beautifully. Thank you so much again for being raw and authentic about it. It is troubling times, and you're right, there is a lot of sickness out there. And the recovery is a different way of recovery now. And this is what you and I are here for, and others out in the world, to help explain that to people and how they can work with that and not succumb to it, not be suppressed by it, not give up hope. All of that. So thank you for that answer. It was awesome. Well, you've been tremendous. Again, thank you so much for coming on, Amanda. Alex and I really appreciate it, and I know the audience appreciates it very much too. You've delivered some beautiful and fabulous content for all of us to take away, and again, thank you very much. So before we sign off to the audience, would you please let them know where we can find Amanda and any sort of way that you'd like us to?
So you can find me by going to my website, which is solfulliving.com, SolFulLiving.com. You can listen to the podcast, Soulful Connections. That's, again, SolFul Connections. And, I have all the social medias that, we all have, except I don't have TikTok. I have not ventured there yet, Kurt. So you can look up Soulful Living on Facebook and Instagram, and LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, there you have it, audience. A fantastic day today. We're celebrating with joy and happiness, and to reach into yourselves and love yourself first. To love thyself is to love thy neighbor, and to love thy neighbor is to love thyself. So let's practice what Amanda has given us here, and we're very thankful for that. So, audience, thank you very much for coming in today and your time and your energy. We appreciate it. And remember, your mind is your power. Stay empowered.